Hello guys, welcome back. My name's Nathan and today we're going to be taking a look at who will go first overall in the 2021 NHL draft. Now I'm eligible for the 2021 draft and I'm going to formally announce here that I will end up skipping this draft. I want to give some other kids a chance in this class to go first overall because we all know if I was available and eligible who would be going number one. But in this draft especially, it's kind of like the 2017 draft from Nico Hischier and Owen Power, but on steroids, where we have no idea who is going to go number one. Whereas in 2017 there was a few options. In this year, in 2021, for me there is 7 different prospects that could be the first overall pick in a year's time. So who do I see as the best prospects in this upcoming draft class, and who do I see going first overall in the 2021 NHL draft? Watch till the end for all the scouting analysis, all the prospect content, and of course hit that big red subscribe button for more prospect videos just like this one. But I do want to start out with the favorite for the number one spot, though that tag is certainly slipping, that being Finnish center Aatu Räty. Now, Räty is an interesting one because over the past couple of seasons, he's been the guy as the number one guy in 2021, and the closer we get to the 2021 draft, the more it kind of slips from his grasp. To me, Räty is a guy that's just good in a lot of different areas. He doesn't really stand out in too much. He's kind of like an Anton Lundell, I would say, maybe a little bit better, but I don't think it's too big of a gap. And he was a guy that's needed to start to really get going last year. Was all right in the Liiga, was all right in the Junior A, but this year has kind of just been eh. In the Liiga, he's gotten 2 goals, 2 points in 6 games played, and in the U20, he's gotten 1 goal, 1 point in 3 games played, which for a first overall pick is not great. The Liiga stats I can kind of excuse because he's playing on the 4th line and he really isn't getting that much deployment, but for a first overall pick to be a 4th line playing in the Liiga doesn't exactly paint the brightest picture for his chances, and that's a guy that, because of the ice time alone, might get passed up by quite a few guys. Now, I wouldn't let that ice time issues fool you too much because I still think Räty is going to be a very good NHL player, but the potential is kind of an issue. For me, as of right now, I have him as a really good second line forward, kind of like how Anton Lundell is, maybe a little bit better, but still it's not that much of a difference. And he kind of falls in line with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in terms of first overall picks, where he's a really good player, didn't really find himself as that first line center option for Edmonton, but still very productive and a very great player to have in that top 6 for the Oilers. Will Räty be a first overall worthy guy? I'm not really sure at this point, and that's kind of my issue, as I don't see the potential to be a number 1 guy on an NHL team. When you're drafting number 1, you kind of want that in your center. So I still think Räty will go pretty high in this draft, but if he doesn't get it going soon, that's a guy that might not just drop from the first overall spot, but could drop a couple of spots as well. And we go on now to the next player who I think could be the first overall pick in 2021, that being defenseman Brandt Clarke. And Brandt Clarke right now is my number 1 prospect in the 2021 draft, but it's not that big of a difference. To me, Brandt Clarke is an interesting one because he is a transitional game beast, and I love those type of players, guys that can get it from the defensive zone all the way to the offensive zone with absolute ease and just make it super efficient, keep the possession, and that's what Brandt Clarke does very well. I think there is some concerns there defensively because I don't think he's as physically engaged as he could be, but that's still a player who has said that he'd mold his game around Erik Karlsson. I'm not sure if he's quite there yet in terms of offensive zone generation, but that's still a player that has a lot of value with his skating, a lot of value with his overall puck skills, and that's a player I wouldn't hate if you picked first overall, especially with the offensive tool set that he has. The only problem is the OHL doesn't start for now like a month and a half to go, so it'll be a little bit late to see Brandt Clarke really do his thing with the Barrie Colts, but at the same time, right now I have him number 1, and he's that lone defenseman with that number 1 spot. I think he's probably the most likely guy at this point to go number 1. Depending on how he does in the OHL, I still think that's a guy that, taking a flyer of that first overall pick, not a bad idea. I'm not really sure if he gets that number 1 defenseman spot, though, on an NHL team. I think he's definitely a top pairing guy, though, and a fantastic power play option, too. Next up, going to the next player I think could go first overall in this 2021 draft, I have the 3rd Hughes brother in Luke Hughes. Now, we talk about both Jack and Quinn as fantastic, or going to be fantastic NHL players in Jack Hughes' case. I think Luke Hughes has the potential to be the best defensive player out of those three. I think Quinn Hughes is going to be more on the offensive side, same thing with Jack. But I think Luke Hughes has honed in his overall game, and that could be the best overall well-rounded player out of those three. To me, Luke Hughes, he just turned 17 this past September, so it makes him one of the youngest players in this draft class. But he's had so many pictures next to Jack Hughes this offseason where he looks like the freaking Gronk next to Jack. And Jack is no slouch, even though he's more on the shorter side. Luke just is an absolute madman. I think he's like 6'3" now. Something absolutely ridiculous. But even though he hasn't gotten off to an amazing offensive start in the USDP, I wouldn't really look at his stats too much. That's still a guy that drives play extraordinarily well. His skating is fantastic for how big he is. And that's a player that defensively, I think, has a lot of maturity already at such a young age. Obviously, the physical game helps, and that physical size does too. But he's just good. He, in my opinion, is what so many people think Jake Sanderson is. I think Jake Sanderson's going to be good, but I think Luke Hughes has amazing agility, amazing acceleration, on top of being a great defensive player, and I think having a lot more of an offensive tool set to him. That's a player that I could see being a #1 guy if his potential fully translates, which is still a big if, but the potential is there to be an absolute monster and to be a main man for Team USA. Moving on now to the next player I think could go first overall in this draft class, I have Canadian winger Dylan Guenther. Now, out of the players I'll mention, I think Guenther probably has the least potential to go first overall. I have #4 in my rankings at the moment, but that's a player who I'm not sure gets up to that first overall spot. But I still think Guenther has an amazing tool set. I still think he's worth a top 5 pick in this draft, and for a lot of different reasons. I mean, he also is on the pre-young side of things, turning 18 this next April. And that's a player that was so good in the dub last season in terms of everything. I mean, his goal scoring was electric, but his playmaking is what is most known for. He was still using that amazingly. I think his offensive tool set is elite, and that's a player that kind of like is a Mitch Marner in some ways, where he's not even that undersized. I mean, he's 6'1", but he kind of feels like it. He's a lot more crafty, though, really deceptive, and I think that's a player that, especially on the power play, will make mincemeat of defenses in the NHL. But, again, I'm not sure if a winger goes first overall, especially with the defensive options that are available. And speaking of, we now get into the next player I think could go first overall. I have Owen Power. Now, Owen Power, easily one of the best names of this entire draft class, could very well end up going first overall. He's playing in the University of Michigan this next season. Fantastic program of Quinn Hughes, of course, just a few years back. And I feel like with Owen Power, he has real potential to gain some serious ground. Right now, I have #5 in my prospect rankings, but that's a guy that could go up to #1. It really does depend on how well he plays, but he has the potential, I think, to be a top-pairing D-man. He really is a solidly well-rounded, like Luke Hughes, has great skating, great offensive awareness too, but has some excellent size, and he uses that to his advantage in the defensive zone. But that's a player that, again, the name is likely, or not likely, what am I talking about? The name suits him very well with his skill, with his size, 6'5". He really does bring a lot of value in that area, and I think that's a player that, again, depending on how well he does with Michigan, could definitely, he's already in the conversation for the first overall pick, of course, being in this video, but that's a player that could really get up there depending on how many points he puts up on the board, which I don't really judge that too much, but you get my gist. Then going on to the next defensive option that could go first overall, this one being Carson Lambos. Now, Carson Lambos is an interesting one. At the moment, I have him just behind Owen Power, but I wouldn't really look at that too much. I think Lambos is going to be fantastic as well. To me, Lambos is probably the best defensive defenseman of this class. Great skating too. He is more in the Jake Sanderson type of things, but that's a guy that can just shut it down so easily and make it just so efficient in his own end. Offensively, I think there also is some pretty sneaky skill there. His shot is brilliant, and that's a guy that I think definitely could bring a lot of value on a power play. But the defense is his bread and butter, and the way he uses his skating to evade pressure and evade chances on the other end really does help his own team, and the Winnipeg Ice are very lucky to have him, that's for sure. I'm not sure if he gets to that first overall spot because, again, he is more on the defensive side of things. But that's still a player I would love to have as a top 10 pick, and especially later in that top 10 would be one of the bigger steals in the 2021 draft. Then going on to the last player I'm going to mention today, and this is one that could be in like the number 15 spot at the end of the year, or it could be as high, I think, as a top 3, maybe even at that number 1 spot, that being Canadian center Kent Johnson. Kent Johnson is a fascinating one. He is a center, a little more on the undersized area, kind of like a Marco Rossi, not that bad, but still. He's going to play with, just like Owen Power, with the University of Michigan this upcoming season in the NCAA. And that's a player that tore up the BCHL last year, put Alex Newhook-like numbers up on the board before his draft year, and that's very, very impressive. To me, he shares a lot of the same qualities as a Mitch Marner, where it's just blasting speed, it's blasting skill, it's all up in your face, and he's always trying to use that. But I feel like his center chances are actually pretty decent. He's great in the face-off dot. I think that's a player that definitely has the integrity and the relentlessness to be a center as well, and the defensive acumen too. I don't think there's too many holes in Kent Johnson's game either, and depending on how much he explodes in the NCAA, which I think he will, that's a player that could go pretty high. The sad thing is, he's one of the oldest players in this draft, so you got to take that into consideration, but still at the same time, his skill is fantastic and definitely worthy at this point of at least a top 10 pick. And depending on how well he does with Michigan, could definitely be in that top 5. Now, I do want to give a couple honorable mentions here to just 2 players who I think could get in the conversation by year's end. I'm going to start out with Swedish defenseman Simon Edvinsson. And Edvinsson is a guy that's been rising up my ranks a lot as of late. He's a guy that has some great overall size, but his skating is brilliant. He's so much fun to watch on the offensive end especially. And that's a player that, depending on how well he plays throughout the rest of the season in Sweden, could get at least in the top 10 conversation. I have him at number 9 in my rankings, but could get even higher by year's end. And the second player I want to mention, and final player I want to mention, is American winger Chaz Lucius. Now, Chaz Lucius is a one that, kind of like a Dylan Guenther, is not likely to be first overall because he's a winger. But Chaz Lucius might be one of the best goal scorers of this draft, if not the best pure goal scorer of this draft, and he is really fun to watch, especially in the offensive zone and on the power play. That's a guy that can just make goals happen. His shot is fantastic, is able to find open ice very easily as well, and I'm hoping he's able to get some consistent time in the USDP this year, really show what he's got, because I think his skill is fantastic. At the moment, I have him ranked number 7. That's a guy that could go very far back in the first round depending on how he plays, but I think at this point is still worthy of a top 10 pick. Now, out of all the players I mentioned today, I think the best chance to go first overall, I'll give a top 3. For me, at number 3, the best chance to go first overall will be Owen Power. Again, he's in a fantastic situation with the University of Michigan, and that's a player that could really do well there. I think he'll have a great season, and again, the last time we saw a player go first overall from the NCAA was Eric Johnson. Didn't really turn out too much for him, but I do think Owen Power does have the potential to be a top pairing D-man and show his strengths in Michigan this upcoming season. Coming at number 2, I'm going to have Aatu Räty still. I think Räty is still a guy that has potential to be that number 1 guy, that number 1 option as the first overall pick. Maybe not a number 1 center, but that's still a player that, depending on how he plays throughout the rest of the year, maybe needs to get more comfortable, maybe get some more ice time, could still definitely be in the conversation for the first overall pick by the year's end. And if that team needs a center, Räty's probably the best option at that point. Then going on to my most likely player to be picked first overall, I'm going to go with OHLer Brandt Clarke, my number 1 on the board right now. That's just a player who I think is going to have a great year in the OHL, really show his maturity as well, really show a lot more of that defensive game that I think he could flow through. But the transition game is elite. That offensive game, while still needing some work in the offensive zone, I still think has potential to be a top pairing worthy D-man and be a guy worthy of a first overall pick, especially offensively. I think he's the most likely guy to be first overall by year's end, and this video might look completely outdated in a year. We'll see what happens, but Brandt is going to be my pick right now, baby. You heard it here first, folks. But that is going to be it for today, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Just a little bit of a quick look at the 2021 draft. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell if you enjoyed. Let me know down in the comments down below, though, who do you think has the best chance to go first overall, and who do you see with that top spot going first in a year's time in the 2021 draft? Make sure you share this video with your friends, get it out there, boys, and click on this card for all of my 2022 draft content right on the playlist. I love you. Yes, you. And I'll see you in the next video or stream. Goodbye.